everyone. So we're going to pick back up on page 89. Our focus for this page is what happens in this crazy scene. And then secondly, what is going to happen now that this event occurred? I know you can probably guess it from some clues throughout this lesson, but something really big happens. And so I want you to ask yourself, what is going to happen after this event as well? So I have decided that I'm just going to read this whole section, and then we will ask all the questions at the end rather than doing it throughout, because I just don't want to interrupt the scene at all. So we're going to start about halfway down the page on page 89. We return back to Lenny and Curly's wife inside the barn. Lenny said, "Maybe if I took this pup out and throwed him away, George would never know, and then I could tend the rabbits without no trouble." Curly's wife said angrily, "Don't you think of nothing but rabbits?" "We gonna have a little place," Lenny explained patiently. "We gonna have a house and a garden and a place for alfalfa. And that alfalfa is for the rabbits. And I take a sack and get it all full of alfalfa, and then I take it to the rabbits." She asked, "What makes you so nuts about rabbits?" Lenny had to think carefully because he could not come to a conclusion. Before he could come to a conclusion, he moved cautiously close to her until he was right against her. "I like to pet nice things. Once at a fair, I had seen some of them long-haired rabbits, and they was nice, you bet. Sometimes I even pet mice, but not when I could get nothing better." Curly's wife moved away from him a little. "I think you're nuts," she said. No, I ain't," Lenny explained earnestly. "George says I ain't. I like to pet nice things with my fingers, soft things." She was a little bit reassured. "Well, who don't?" she said. Everybody likes that. I like to feel silk and velvet. Do you like to feel velvet?" Lenny chuckled with pleasure. "Oh, you bet. By God," he cried happily. "And I had some, too. A lady gave me some, and that lady was my own Aunt Clara. She gave it right to me, about this big a piece. I wish that I had that velvet right now." A frown came over his face. "I lost it," he said. I ain't seen it in a long time." Curly's wife laughed at him. "You're nuts," she said, "but you're kind of a nice fella, just like a big baby. But a person can kind of see what you mean. When I'm doing my hair, sometimes I just sit and stroke it because it's so soft." To show how she did it, she ran her fingers over the top of her head. "Some people got kind of coarse hair," she said complacently. "Take Curly. His hair is just like wire, but mine is soft and fine. Of course, I brush it a lot. That makes it fine. Here, feel, right here." She took Lenny's hand and put it on her head. "Feel right around there and see how soft it is." Lenny's big fingers fell to stroking her hair. "Now don't you muss it up," she said. Lenny said, "Oh, that's nice," and he stroked harder. "Oh, that's nice. Look out. Now you'll mess it up." And then she cried angrily, "Okay, you stop it now. You'll mess it all up." She jerked her head sideways, and Lenny's fingers closed on her hair and hung on. "Let go," she cried. "You let go." Lenny was in a panic. His face was contorted. She screamed then, and Lenny's other hand closed over her mouth and nose. "Please don't," he begged. "Oh, please don't do that. George will be mad." She struggled violently under his hands. Her feet battered on the hay, and she writhed to be free. And from under Lenny's hand came a muffled screaming. Lenny began to cry with fright. "Oh, please don't do none of that," he begged. "George is going to say I done a bad thing. He ain't going to let me tend no rabbits." He moved a hand a little, and her hoarse cry came out. Then Lenny grew angry. "Now don't," he said. "I don't want you to yell. You're gonna get me in trouble just like George says you will. Now, don't you do that." and she continued to struggle, and her eyes were wild with terror. He shook her then, and he was angry with her. "Don't you go yelling," he said, and he shook her, and her body flopped like a fish. And then she was still, for Lenny had broken her neck. He looked down at her, and carefully he removed his hand from over her mouth, and she lay still. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, "but George will be mad if you yell." When she didn't answer nor move, he bent closely over her. He lifted her arm and let it drop. For a moment he seemed bewildered, and then he whispered in fright, "Oh, I done a bad thing. I done another bad thing." He pawed at the hay until it partly covered her. From outside the barn came a cry of men. And the double clang of shoes on metal. For the first time, Lenny became conscious of the outside. He crouched down in the hay and listened. "Oh, I done a real bad thing," he said. "I shouldn't have did that. George will be mad." And he said, "And hide in the brush till he come. He's going to be mad. In the brush till he come. That's what he said." Lenny went back and looked at the dead girl. The puppy lay close to her. Lenny picked it up. "I'll throw him away," he said. "It's bad enough like this." He put the pup under his coat, and he crept to the barn wall and peered out between the cracks toward the horseshoe game, and then he crept around the end of the last manger and disappeared. So this thing that he keeps saying right here, hide in the brush till he come, at the very beginning of the book, you might recall that George told Lenny, where they spent the night right before they got to the ranch for the first time, he said, "If you ever get in trouble, come back to this spot and hide in the brush till I come and find you." So that's what Lenny tells himself he needs to do in this moment. So the sun streaks were high on the wall by now, and the light was growing soft in the barn. Curly's wife lay on her back, and she was half covered with hay. It was very quiet in the barn, and the quiet of the afternoon was on the ranch. Even the clang of the pitched shoes, even the voices of the men in the game seemed to grow more quiet. The air in the barn was dusky in advance of the outside day. A pigeon flew in through the open hay door and circled and flew out again. Around the last stall came a shepherd bitch, lean and long with heavy hanging dugs. Halfway to the packing box were the puppies where she caught the dead scent of Curly's wife, and the hair arose along her spine. She whimpered and cringed to the packing box and jumped in among the puppies. Curly's wife lay with a half covering of yellow hay, and the meanness and the plannings and the discontent and the ache for attention were all gone from her face now. She was very pretty and simple, and her face was sweet and young. Now her rouged cheeks and her reddened lips made her seem alive and sleeping very lightly. The curls, tiny little sausages, were spread on the hay behind her head, and her lips were parted. As happens sometimes, a moment settled and hovered and remained for much more than a moment, and sound stopped and movement stopped for much, much more than a moment. Then gradually time awakened again and moved sluggishly on. The horses stamped on the other side of their feeding racks, and the halter chains clinked. Outside, the men's voices became louder and clearer. From around the end of the last stall, old Candy's voice came. "Lenny," he called. "Oh, Lenny, you in here? I've been figuring some more. I tell you what we can do, Lenny." Old Candy appeared around the end of the last stall. "Oh, Lenny," he called again, and then he stopped, and his body stiffened. He rubbed his smooth wrist on his white stubble whiskers. "I didn't know you was in here," he said to Curly's wife. When she didn't respond, he stepped near. "You oughtn't to sleep out here," he said disapprovingly, and then he was beside her. And, "Oh, Jesus Christ!" He looked about helplessly, and he rubbed his beard, and then he jumped up and went out quickly out of the barn. But the barn was alive now. The horses stamped and snorted, and they chewed the straw of their bedding, and they clashed the chains of their halters. In a moment, Candy came back, and George was with him. George says, "What was it you wanted to see me about?" Candy pointed at Curly's wife. George stared. "What's the matter with her?" he asked. He stepped closer, and then he echoed Candy's words. "Oh, Jesus Christ!" He was down on his knees beside her. He put his hand over her heart, and finally, when he stood up, slowly and stiffly, his face was as hard and as tight as wood, and his eyes were hard. Okay, everyone, so let's talk about character archetypes. We have 4 questions coming to you. They're going to move quick, and then we will move on towards the end of our lesson. So focus in on these. So let's talk about character archetypes. We talked before about how characters can fall into multiple character archetypes. So there's really 2 that fits into Curly's wife, or kind of apply to her specifically. So we talked early in the novel and frequently about how she is the femme fatale. Remember that a femme fatale is a mysterious and seductive woman whose charms ensnare her lovers. So she's seductive, flirtatious, and her charms kind of ensnare her lovers, leading them into dangerous and deadly situations. Now, a damsel in distress is different. A damsel in distress is a vulnerable woman who needs to be rescued. So if you ever think of like the old Scooby-Doo cartoons where Daphne would always get caught by the monster and then she would need to be saved in the end, that is a classic example of a damsel in distress. So think about those 2 things. So the first question I want you to answer, the thing that we've talked about throughout the novel, in what ways is Curly's wife the femme fatale in this scene? In what ways does she fit this first character archetype? You can reread that description as you answer to help you. So, by being seductive and flirtatious and going against Lenny's demands, because remember, Lenny says he's not supposed to talk to her, he doesn't want to talk to her. She goes against that, she keeps flirting with him. She led Lenny into a situation that he was not able to handle. So she kind of entrapped him in this deadly and dangerous situation. So then my second question comes to you. In what ways is Curly's wife the damsel in distress in the scene? In what ways is she a vulnerable woman who needs to be rescued? Answer that now. So, she could be viewed as a damsel in distress in the scene because her loneliness is so painful that she will talk to anyone, despite the advertised risks, and she is vulnerable to Lenny's misguided attack. So remember, she needs to be rescued, not necessarily just from Lenny in the setting, but she also needs to be rescued from her miserable life and loneliness. So that is going to now bring us into question 2. There are 2 acts of violence, Lenny killing his puppy and Lenny killing Curly's wife. What do these acts of violence emphasize about Lenny? Answer that in 2 to 3 sentences. So, Lenny is unable to control his emotions, and his lack of control often leads to accidental violence. So, saying that, Lenny, although innocent in his intentions, he did not want to kill the puppy, and he did not want to hurt Curly's wife. Even though he's innocent in his intentions, he still kills the things he loves. So then, this is going to bring us to a last question. I want you to think deeply about this. So Curly's wife's death is the turning point of the novel. Okay, notice how Steinbeck uses a hyperbole, so remember that means an extreme exaggeration, to emphasize the importance of this moment. So here's what the author wrote in on page 92. As happens sometimes, a moment settled and hovered and remained for much more than a moment, and sound stopped and movement stopped for much, much more than a moment. So my question to you then, Curly's wife's death is much, much more than a physical death. Tell me in 1 to 2 sentences, what else has died at this moment? Don't say the puppy. It's not the puppy. So kind of like metaphorically, when Curly's wife died, what else died in this moment? 1 to 2 sentences. So this is likely the death of George and Lenny and Candy's dream. Although Lenny has made mistakes before, he is never murdered. In a broad sense, it's the death of hope and the promise of prosperity during otherwise hopeless times. Their one dream that they were hanging on to that always gave them hope. This has kind of ruined everything. So it is the death of more than just Curly's wife. It is now the death of all their dreams and hopes. Okay, just a quick announcement. I am on the next clip when you screen over, it's just going to be the video from the movie of this scene that we just read. There's no questions attached to it. You do not have to watch it if you do not want. After that will be your exit ticket, and you'll be good to go.